professional advisors are available to you and understand the framework under which we list, most of them would choose. And now the valuations also are better. And by the way, this is not a new phenomenon. If we go back and look at, let's say, the FMCG sector, it is true that Procter & Gamble India or Hindustan Lever have always traded at better multiples than the parent companies. It is also true in the banking and financial services sector. If you look at the price to book ratios of Indian banks versus any of the US domicile listed banks, again, you'll find that Indian investors are more bullish on these companies and pay them better valuations. So I think what we are seeing in tech is a continuation of what has already been true for a while. But again, regulations are, create a framework. And when a framework is very rigid, when it's a steel framework as opposed to, let's say, being a cotton framework where companies can choose, it's different. I can tell you many cons of being listed overseas. For example, if a company is too small, it lists overseas, it can become an orphan listing. Okay, there is no research coverage, there's hardly any trading liquidity. Companies listed overseas, but it's just in name, right? So I think it is a very important decision. And again, it is our view that most of them would choose to list in the home market, in this case, India. But it's not always the case. And you have to allow that degrees of freedom to founders to decide if something else were to do it.
Because you spoke about, let's say, the consumer giants, HUL versus Unilever, Procter & Gamble. You've also talked about the banking in the NBFC space. Now, I would like to elaborate on that because when we look at the startup universe and technology innovation from India, where we are dominating and what we're giving as building for the world also is our fintech. We're clearly a dominant player in that. So I want to ask you about fintech specifically. Do you prefer overseas listing?
Fintech is a very broad space, Narendra, because it can go from everything from enterprise payments to a card issuance platform. So again, it is in some cases it may make sense. Now, if you see fintech in the consumer fintech, and we obviously have MobiKwik on file, we have Paytm on file, and let's see how the market responds in terms of the demand for their IPOs. But there may be some very specific fintech platforms that may be better understood or may have a bigger customer base overseas, in which case at least they should be allowed to consider if an overseas listing makes sense for them. The process is complex, it is expensive, okay. It is only when lots of conditions are met that a company would consider or should consider listing overseas. So I think, let me flip it of the cons of listing overseas. So the cons are, the company has got to be bigger to stand out, because just as you said, right, if you have $50 trillion of market cap already in the US, there's got to be something exceptional about a company. Now, that said, there are companies from Europe, from Brazil, from other Latin American countries, from Russia. So there's a company called Yandex, that is listed in the US. It's a Russian company. The largest e-commerce company from Russia is a company called Ozon. It's also listed in the US. There is a European fashion company called Farfetch, which has chosen to list in the US. Spotify is a European company for the world, chose to list in the US. Now, those countries do not tell Spotify that, hey, you have to list in Sweden, or wherever they might be from. Most companies choose to list in their home market. That's just a reality everywhere. And I think that will be true for India as well, but there is a small set of companies which should be better served by listing overseas, despite the cons. And I think the barriers to overseas listing are actually very high.
So can I put you in a spot and ask you, and you feel free to look outside of the Sequoia portfolio as well. What kind of companies would be great to list overseas? Just for our viewers to get an idea as well.
Sure. So I think the software as a service companies, the SaaS models, which serve customers primarily in international markets, would be better served by listing, because SaaS is a very developed space. There's deep sector research and understanding of how each metric of their business should look like. That's an obvious one. I would say for some e-commerce companies, and again, I say that because, Mercado Libre from Latin America and Ozon and Farfetch and Bava and others have chosen to list in the US. That's also a sector that's very well understood in the United States. I would say if in the very emerging sectors such as biotech, again, we don't have such easy companies to point to, but like tomorrow, if some company were to invent some breakthrough technology in, let's say, in energy management, or a new kind of battery technology, that should also perhaps think about being listed in the US because they would be global companies from day one.
Okay, so there will be global companies from day one that are building for the world from India. But as I come to an end of this conversation, India is the third largest startup ecosystem, right? But we are a very distant third when you come from the number 1 and 2 players, which are US and China. So as we catch up and dream of being number 1, for that, in the interim for that, is it imperative or is it a hindrance if these companies and unicorns are not allowed to list overseas?
I would say it could be a hindrance because ultimately it's about self-confidence, right? As they say that if you truly want to know if somebody loves you, set them free and see if they come back. So give them the choice to list in the market that's most appropriate. And, we believe that most of them would choose to list in India, which is their home market, for multiple reasons that we discussed. But for the few where it makes sense outside, and I think it's a tool that other countries have already given their startups. We are the third largest startup ecosystem, but again, we should not take that for granted.
China's removing it though. China's getting rid of it though.
Narendra, even better. That's the perfect opportunity. So we should not copy other people's mistakes.
You should seize the moment, in fact, is the case that you're making.
See, international trade and advantage is about relative advantage. We have a moment in time when the world is increasingly focused on India because of what's happened, in the China regulatory environment. I think this is the time when India has to take advantage and allow more of this capital and more startup formation to happen because it's a flywheel and we got to make sure that we can add speed and velocity to the flywheel by making some of this stuff happen.
And it shouldn't be like ADRs and necessarily dual listing, etc., right? Just give the option the way we have been talking about, that you're saying that other domiciles have started giving. And with that, Piyush, I'd like to thank you for taking the time out for joining us here. It is, of course, a really hot topic at the moment. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Very good to speak to you, Narendra.